All right, so what determines how quickly a population will grow? What is the main thing that sociologists and demographers and people who study these different things look at is a set of variables called age distribution. Okay? Age distribution. And that's simply how many individuals are in certain age ranges within that particular society. There's a very young society where you have a lot of people that are in the 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15 age groups, or what they call cohorts is another word for that. Or is it an old population? We have a lot of people in your plus 60 ranges. Okay? So these things, these different types of age structures do occur in different societies around the world. As we'll see, there's a reason why a population will be in one or two or one or the other of these different age groups or the age structures. But the important thing that we're looking at on this particular slide is how that influences how fast the population is going to grow over the next, usually 10 years is the average time period. When we look at populations, you may know that in the United States, and I think pretty much all around the world, most industrialized countries, they do a census every 10 years. So typically when we look at population growth, we're looking at what's going to happen over the next 10-year period. Okay, so what we see is that those societies where most of the population is below the reproductive years, I'm going to give you 20 to 40. That's close enough. It's actually considered to be globally 15 to 40.
Whoa.
And I know maybe that sounds,
Whoa.
except for those of you who are teen mom fans, that may sound a little shocking to you, but you have to realize that in many developing nations of the world, it is common practice for girls actually to be married and start having children at that age. So that is considered to be by the, powers that be, the people that do this kind of stuff, they usually call those the reproductive years between 15 to 40. So what you find is that actually, rather than the fastest growing populations being those where the most individuals are in that reproductive age group, that because we go 10 years ahead, that actually we see our fastest population growth in those societies that have most of their members in the 0 to 15 group. Because once again, there's a 10-year jump there, and they actually break it down by fives, typically in most histograms, as we'll see in a minute. But there's a 10-year period there where you're going to have a lot of people going into the 15 to 20 and the 20 to 25 year age group, which, like I said, in most of the world is developing, that's the prime times in which women will have children. And also when women have children in societies or in general at a younger age, start having a younger age, they have more children. Okay, so this will, as we'll see, and I'll show you some what they call histograms, graphs of it, then you can just see pretty quickly. This is going to have the fastest population growth rate. Second to that is those where you're going to have most of your individuals in the reproductive years, because what's going to happen there, that means not only do you have a narrower number that is pre-reproductive, a lower number, and therefore going into the reproductive years over 10 years, that you'll also have a good chunk that is going past or beyond that reproductive age. Okay, and that also means that those, since they're moving up in the reproductive age of 15 to 40, as you can see this as well in our society, even that once you get past 30, the number of children that women have, even though they're still in the reproductive age, is much lower. Okay, so that's why we see second highest reproductive growth rate. And then if you have a large number of people, the majority of the people in your society are past that reproductive age, past the age of 40, your population growth rate will actually go in reverse, because this is an aging population. You're going to have, of course, people dying. That's part of the equation. When we look at overall population growth, it's birth minus death. I think I may have mentioned that to you when we did K&R Strategist, but it's pretty simple. Your birth rate minus your death rate is equal to your population growth rate. Okay. And so you're going to have people dying off, and you're also going to have not as many people as before going into reproductive ages to replace them. Okay? So you may end up actually having a shrinking population. We see this actually in some societies, countries. By the way, we tend to, of course, refer to societies as countries, of course, but society is a better term that you can use in the absence. Some countries do have different societies that operate differently and have different properties within them. So, but generally, we'll talk about when we look at these things as usually countries, entire countries and stuff. The age population is known mainly to the living, environmental. I'm going to say no to both of those. Economic conditions. And when I say conditions, I don't mean good or bad, okay? Just what is the basis for income generation in that society. Really, how does that society feed itself is what it comes down to. Feed and shelter that itself, and then above and beyond that, other things that are attained. How does that function? Is it mostly agricultural, or what we call industrial, or technical? There's a lot of different ways in which that works out, and it has a big influence on the demographics of the society. Once again, that kind of encompasses all this, the economics, the age structure, all these different things come together to do that. And then you have one particular factor that stands out, and that is within society the role and the empowerment of women. So that shows that plays an important part because, of course, women are what we call the reproductive gatekeepers. They're the ones that actually determine how fast populations will grow. Yeah, and I'll give you a little diagram here in a minute to illustrate that a little better, but you can figure it out that women obviously can only have a certain number of children within a lifetime at their maximum fertility rate, and therefore the distribution also, the sex ratio is another one that's in there that we haven't really talked about yet, but that has an influence on that. Any questions? Yeah, Doug.
You said birth rate and death rate. Birth rate minus the death rate is what again?
The population rate, growth rate. Okay, so as mentioned before, there are certain things that determine what kind of age structure a population is going to have, and therefore how fast that population is going to grow. Okay, so sociologists have determined there to be basically 4 phases that a society can go through or will go through as its economy shifts, particularly as its economy shifts away from agriculture. Okay, and much of the world, not most of it, but much of it has gone to at least stage 3, and some is going into stage 4, which one of the things you'll notice when I show you some graphs is that for the post-industrial, it's all pretty theoretical because we haven't had any societies that have stayed there for long enough to study what happens with these in these societies. But there are phases that it goes through, like I said, as its economy shifts from individuals being involved into agricultural to them having different roles in the workplace. I want to stress, and I think I said this before when we talked about agriculture, is that when societies tend to shift away from being an agricultural society or pre-industrial, it does not mean that there's not agriculture still going on. As you should be aware of, you still have to grow food, and high populations need even more food. It's just that what the people do tends to shift away as these farms, which were originally individually owned farms or family owned farms, or maybe people cooperating together, turn into industrially owned farms, and the kind of shifts you see going from there as a society tends to go through its industrialization process. Okay, so still just as much farming going on, it's just less people doing it, larger corporate interests and things like that tend to do it when we shift out of the pre-industrial phase. So when I say economies are predominantly agricultural, it means that most of the people in that economy, that's what they do. They grow their own food to one extent or another. Truly, in these societies, there's low development of currency, and these particular kinds of societies are actually pretty rare. Now, you'll find pockets of this within countries, larger countries, of people that are still pretty much in this particular phase. But finding an entire country that is completely pre-industrial, I'm not sure you'd be hard-pressed to be able to do that. Because a lot of it, of the move from this into transitional is coming from care groups who go into these areas and help them help them treat their diseases and help with sanitation, things like that. And those types of groups have penetrated most areas of the world. But in this particular type of society, when you do have that, you have high birth rates and high death rates. The high birth rates are desirable because when you have your own farm, having more people to work on that farm, you can get to the point where usually in these areas the land is not, there's enough land that's undeveloped that if you have more children, you can develop more land and get more food produced from it. So that does turn into a level of profit when you have surplus, and then that surplus can be taken into town or wherever and exchanged with somebody else. So if you got extra corn, you could get some a dress for Ma for the year or something like that. But that's what I mean by not a highly developed monetary system usually, because a lot of people are self-sufficient on their farm with what they need, and then they do a little bit of trade and barter to achieve these things. Once again, not that common throughout the world, but there's still some areas where this is prevalent. The high birth rates not only give people for the farm, they tend to have high infant mortality rates, sadly. And so, when women have children that die early, I say women because they're, of course, the ones that are having the children. When couples have children, a lot of times it's a good chance that child is going to die before the age of 10. Then they will tend to have more children for obvious reasons. So they have high birth rates, but they also have high death rates. Remember, growth, or the rate, equals birth minus death. So if both of these are high, then your overall growth rate is either going to be 0 if they're the same, or it's going to be relatively low. Okay, usually. I mean, you usually don't see one unless they have a outbreak of a disease or something like that, where the death rate beats out the birth rate and it starts to shrink. But usually you'll see a constant, steady growth rate in these particular ones. Much of the world, of course, was this way prior to the Industrial Revolution. And as a matter of fact, from the Industrial Revolution through, most countries of the world were like this, with pockets of industrialization going on and then spreading over the next 200 years or so. Okay. Then you have a transitional society where the economy is starting to rise. What do you mean by rise, Rebate? Be just a little bit more descriptive, and I might be able to give you the point, but if not, rise. How's an economy rise?
I just figured because it said better healthcare is available, and then it said transitional, so we thought it was like kind of rising into that industrial boom and stuff.
Very good. Oops, sorry. You said the right word. Yeah, then I erased your point. Good, I get to take a point off of it. Industrialize. Okay, starting to. So like I said, a lot of times this takes the form of care organizations, whether religious or non-religious, secular, whatever you want to call it. People going in to help out people that do have high death rates, high infant mortality rates, because of diseases and a lot of times sanitation and other kinds of things like that. The death rate in these societies, when you come in with antibiotics, will drop drastically, as you can imagine. You have a lot of people dying off from infectious diseases, that death rate will drop off dramatically. Birth rates don't tend to drop as quickly. People still have the idea. As a matter of fact, back in this phase, having a big family was a sign of wealth. So as these things, those kind of value type of things, generational type of things, take a while to start to have their effect. Whereas but like I said, the death rate will drop very quickly. So consequently, in this particular phase, population growth rates are high. Okay, because remember, the rate is going to be equal to the birth rate. That stays about the same. This number drops, and of course, your population numbers are going to grow very rapidly. Most of the world right now is a transitional society. Okay, with most of the world's population, because you got to count in. We count in there India and China. Okay, there's always some things about them, like China's one-child policy that affect it and change that to some extent. But in general, most of the world is actually still in this transitional phase, which means most of the world, the population is growing rapidly. And when we see that kind of rapid population growth, that's when we see a lot of the environmental problems that follow from there. Okay. And then we have industrial societies, and I'll come back to this. I've said this a few times before. Hopefully you've been listening at some point or another at one time during this year that has just progressed, that you have here one at a time or another. But in these what we also call developing nations, these transitional societies, they either don't have the technology to be able to enforce and regulate environmental regulations, environmental problems, or they really don't want to. Their people are just coming out of poverty. They're still somewhat impoverished. They have a different type of poverty now when it's becoming urban, and they need that money, and therefore they're not as in tune, I guess you could say, to environmental regulations and things like that. So we see a lot of pollution in these countries, a lot of other kinds of things that are happening because they haven't really gotten to the stage where they start to create and be able to enforce laws and have the technology, of course, that's a big part, to be more environmentally responsible. Okay. Then we get to the industrial phase of society. This, of course, is where you see most people are employed in, I would say, industrial / technological. I mean, they're pretty much the same thing. It's you're not working on the farm anymore. You could include service and everything in there as well, but in general, we call it industrial. Women do reproduce later. That's actually the term I've used for a while. This is actually the most accurate term to put here. But I'm going to go out on a limb and be traditional and say marry. Yeah. So, well, I'll tell you this. The reason why is not just from a moral aspect. I can't teach you guys that, and it's better not coming from me. But to study population changes and demographics and things like that, having a society where the majority of children production comes within what we call a nuclear family, i.e. two parents raising children, that's the conventional models. That's easy to follow when you're assuming that those two are going to have so many children. So on, something we call, well, we're almost there to replacement fertility. That's when you can actually use these particular values. But if you have a society where it's a very loose structure of paternalism and things, and if you don't have that so much, it's much harder to predict what's going to happen from there. Okay, so within industrial society, we do see women becoming much more part of the workforce, becoming employed, becoming educated, and what was the other E word I said on the first slide? Becoming what? What was the word?
Empowered.
Empowered, right, which means what? What can they do? What does it mean if you're empowered? Ladies, it's actually one of the things that we can, or at least you guys can be thankful for in a country like ours. Empowered, what's it mean, Raina?
Oh, did you skip that blank?
I may have, I did, yeah. Nobody put anything there anyway, so I'm sure you're really curious about that word. But right now, I'll put down what this is if you'll tell me what empowered means, or what it would mean if you were...
I think it means when you, have power.
To do what?
To change.
To change, well, change your clothes, change whatever, but actually to determine your own life, whether or not you want to get married or not. So once again, I like to stress that you can be thankful for certain things, and there's many societies in the world still where marriages are arranged, And they're done so because having children and all those other kind of things and putting families together, kind of, is a way to protect yourself and your family and, bless you, in a society, and making sure that everybody's fed and things like that. A lot of these countries, they don't have food programs and things like that, where you know, if people don't have enough, they starve to death. Malnutrition is still a big issue. So people do things to cooperate together, and one of the things that's been done for probably thousands of years is one family will marry another family to combine assets. It's a business arrangement, so to speak. And of course the kids, you know, like I said, a lot of times they're young, they don't have any say-so in the matter, okay? So there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of areas. The second most populated, soon to be most populated country in the world is going to be what? India, yeah. India, and I'm not an expert on this, but I know that there's still a fair amount of arranged marriages in India, where the women don't have a lot of say-so on who they can marry, and this kind of thing happens, okay? So, empowerment means that a woman can say, no, I don't want to get married at 15, I want to go to school, I want to go to college, I want to work, get into the workplace, and things like that, which of course is what happens in your industrialized societies like the United States and then the European countries, Japan, etc. And biologically speaking and just socially speaking, when a woman does not choose to have children at a younger age, when they choose to follow, say, a career track or something, they don't have as many children, right? So, and of course employment is part of that as well. It's hard to keep a job and have children, etc., or to go up the workplace ladder in that case. So we see therefore the birth rate slowing down, and the whole overall rate then starts to slow down. This is your positive side here. Maybe getting older. These societies may also be getting older, so the death rate's starting to climb up in those a little bit. So your population growth rate slows considerably. Okay. Then you can get to a point where you have a post-industrial society. Aging. Should that have me in it? Doesn't look right.
No,
Whatever. We'll figure it out. Good thing this is on tape.
no, I think it's right.
Anyway, you know what I mean. This population is getting older. The majority of the population tends to be in the upper cohorts of that histogram. They may have a negative growth rate or get to that point. They will get there if their fertility rate goes down to below replacement fertility. So y'all pay attention to this. This is an important concept to understand. Okay? And think about it for a second. All right. Now the fertility rate is the average number of children a woman has in a society. Y'all get off your phones, please pay attention. That is, if that amount, if the number of children on average that women have in a society is equal to 2, and it's a perfect transfer, every 2 children that grows up, they have 2 children and so on, excuse me, what will be the overall population growth rate of that country? 2 children. Well, think of it this way: 2 parents, 2 children. Parents die, children go along, they have 2 children. They die, children go along, they have 2 children. They die, what will be the population growth rate? 0. 0. Okay? Now, so that is technically the ideal replacement fertility. You're replacing, when you have 2 children, you're replacing yourself. As far as population numbers go, you're replacing the 2 parents that have them. That's why I said with 2 parents, it helps we make sure that this is, just 2 parents having children. If you drop, now, the accepted value, generally accepted value within industrial societies is 2.1. And this is because not every child is going to grow up, even in industrial sized society, to have children, or they may choose not to have children. So they tend to bump it up, okay? In back here in a transitional society, the replacement rate is usually about actually 2.4. But that doesn't matter because they're transitional societies, so usually their fertility rates are well above that anyway. But when you start to drop down, and women start having less children, and you get to the point where you're below 2.1, then theoretically, eventually, you're going to have more people dying than are being born. And of course, if the birth rate is lower than the death rate, then this number is going to be, what about? Negative, right? So that means that society is actually going to shrink. This is happening in Japan, this is happening in Eastern European countries. I've got one source that says Italy's in this particular situation. This will happen. It takes some time, though, as you can imagine. Like I said, you have to, before you start that, fertility is correct. Before you start doing that, you have to have the older generation die off. And of course, in these types of societies, people live to a long age, live for a long time, have longevity. There's the phenomenon of this particular change taking place very slowly is known as population momentum. So as you can see, the effect of having an aging population and having fertility rates drop in a society is going to take a while. It's going to take, for the grandparents to start dying off, to finally feel the effect of that cohort, as we say, not having as many children. But in general, this is something, and also I may mention that we haven't really seen this play out completely. We know that, for example, in certain countries the population numbers are going down, but they may have an immigration or immigration issue also that's causing this to happen. But this is a predicted area of the graph. Okay. All right. Finally, what we tend to see here is that as you go through this transition, the quality of life, as your book defines it, and in general, the course defines it, is based upon infant mortality rates and longevity. And I struggled kind of with this, of doing this for a minute and thinking about it, because I thought to myself, yeah, but in some ways I would take that living off the land kind of lifestyle over an urban environment where I was well fed in some ways. But then when you really start to think about it, this is why these two particular factors are important, is these are based upon so many of the environmental factors that are there. Food supply. That's a big, we don't think about that so much because America overeats, but you have a lot of people around the world that are still starving to death, a lot of children. Very sadly, that is the case. So that's one thing, that having an adequate food supply, that would certainly be a big factor of quality of life. And then of course disease. Disease is, one of the bummers of life, if you will. It's one of the things that makes life difficult. There's our higher rates of disease, and that's why your longevity is not as great in these areas. Sanitation, which of course is a lot of times the source of disease, how well how good the drinking water supply is and how well you can dispose of your wastewater. Those also affect these factors here as well. So we get a whole, when you look at those two things, they really can sum up how good it is, so to speak, to live in that country, or that society, I should say. So that's what our two main things are about how we determine quality of life. And it's generally accepted that the quality of life gets greater as you go through this particular process. Okay. Any questions? Awesome. Okay, so we have already mentioned that the growth rate is the birth rate minus the death rate. Like I said, kind of obvious. The birth rate adds to the population. Death rate takes away from the population. We also have two other main factors that will affect the rate at which a population grows. And that, of course, is going to be the immigration and emigration rate. Now, technically, this is pronounced emigration. I'm going to say emigration just so you don't get the two confused. Okay? And so, the other thing you need to know is that with these values, that demographers, yes, that's a job, like to use 1,000 as the reference number. Okay? Whereas in percentages, what's the reference number? 100. So I guess the percentage numbers were always too small, so they decided to go with 1,000 as the ratio or the reference number for these different values. So out of 1,000, how many were born? How many out of 1,000 of that population immigrated? Minus how many died and how many immigrated or moved out. And we could do this right here. Otherwise, this is good. Now notice the good thing about it is that these are all the same denominator. Almost forgot that term for a minute. I don't know about you guys, but adding and subtracting fractions to me is harder than calculus. If you've had calculus, you've had both. You know what I'm talking about. Fortunately, we've got common denominators, so that's not going to be an issue, right? So all you're going to have to worry about is these numbers up here, okay? And that's going to give you what they call the crude growth rate. Once again, I'm not sure why they call it crude. I think it has to do with just not factoring in a lot of other things. If you divide the annual crude or birth growth rate, that is not correct. Whoa. Yeah. Neither one of those, sorry. Percentage growth rate into the number 1,000? No. Now, granted, this was a shot in the dark, or some of you may have heard this before. It's actually used in finance. It's called the rule of 70. And it gives a very, very close approximation. Now, I will say this, that when you talk about these different growth rate factors and stuff like that, since they are not linear relationships all the time, it can deviate from this a little bit. But it's pretty well relied upon, both, like I said, in population growth as well as in finance. Like if you have an investment and you know what the percentage growth of that's going to be profit-wise, you know, how investments work, hopefully, that you can predict how long it takes for that particular amount, in this case population, to double. So that's what the rule says. It says that if you divide the annual percentage growth rate into the number 70, it's going to tell you how many years it takes for that population to double. So it's a nice little way for us to look at for a society and estimate, you know, how long it will take for that to happen, how long it will take for a population to double. I will say in finance you use this because this represents when you have made your investment back. So you can kind of plan things out that way and say, all right, by the time we get here, we will have made back our investment. We can take it back, and everything else is money on top of it. In this case, so if we've got a population growth rate, for example, of 3.5%. No, I don't want to do that. How many years is it going to take for that population to double? Anybody guess earlier tomorrow?
20.
Very good, 20 years. Rule of 70 divided by 3.5. Got to make sure that's a percent. That equals 20. 70 divided by 3.5 equals 20. You should be able to do calculations of that level in your head. Okay, or on paper without a calculator. Because that's what you're going to be required to do. That's what you're going to be required to do on the test, as well as on the AP environmental exam. No calculators are allowed. So hopefully you can, or will be able to. Any questions how that works? Both how you figure out the actual population growth rate, as well as how you use the rule of 70. Okay? All right, we're going to do some more of these on Wednesday. And we'll talk about it more then.